If you are watching this, it probably means you are in your season-long fantasy football championship. So first of all, a congratulations to you on that. Congratulations on a fantastic season. We made it to week 17. So let's dive on in, get you set for those waivers so you can lock in that championship for 2021. This is the Waiver Wire Q&A. That's right here on the FanDuel YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and Twitter channels. My name is Jim Sannes. I am a senior writer and analyst for NumberFire.com, joined here as always by JJ Zachariason, editor-in-chief of Number Fire and FanDuel. JJ, it is Christmas week. We wrapped up Christmas. We've got championships coming up this weekend. It is a fun time to talk some fantasy football. How you doing today?
I'm good, but I will say, I don't love the schedule change with the NFL because typically as a fantasy analyst, your season's done after week 16. And it was the perfect timing every year because it was right before the holidays started. So you could wrap everything up, after Christmas, you could watch some football, see if you win a championship or not. And we don't get that anymore. Now we have to do all this stuff for an extra week, which, we love talking to all of you, of course, but it's an extra week of work for us. So it's a little bit difficult.
Yeah, so typically when I'm in Minnesota to visit my parents, I get to set up my end of year spreadsheets, and to log data after the final games are done. And I don't get to do that this year. And postponing my spreadsheet freakout week is sad. So I think that's the biggest downside. Extra week of work, whatever. I'm sad about having to wait on my spreadsheet. So that's the biggest downside here. BJJ Freak saying Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to you, and Happy New Year to you as well. As always, we're going to take your questions no matter where you're watching. We'll take them from Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter. Does not matter. Get those questions in. We'll take them live here on air and get you set for the waiver runs for today. Let's start things off with Grim Fan over on YouTube asking about waiver wire running backs for this week. Dare Ogunbowale or Rex Burkhead. Now, Burkhead popped up this week with David Johnson being out. David Johnson may not be healthy, also went on the COVID list, but now we're seeing a situation where the COVID rules may be changed, which could allow David Johnson to be cleared before Sunday's game. So, JJ, got Ogunbowale out there with James Robinson now done for the year. Burkhead, in his situation, do you have a preference between these two guys?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really love either guy that much. I'll be honest with you. I had both of them in the 15 transactions column this week because you kind of just have to, right? It's just that time of year, and running back is tough to find. But with Rex Burkhead, yes, he went off this past week, but if you look at his peripheral numbers, they really weren't any different than what we've seen from Burkhead any other week. Actually, if you look at what he did week 15 versus week 16, his week 15 peripherals were actually better than his week 16 peripherals. He had a better target share last week, and he had just as good of a running back rush share. It's just that the matchup was good, and they actually saw a positive game script, and that allowed them to have a better pass rate in that game, which benefited Rex Burkhead. So, it was sort of like a perfect storm for Burkhead. I don't think we should view Burkhead any differently than we did entering, week 15 or week 14, where he was more of a sleeper than anything else. Whereas with Dare Ogunbowale, I think that you can feel a little bit more confident that he is going to see a pretty big workload, at least in terms of market share of his backfield. The problem is that I don't think Jacksonville is going to be able to move the ball all that well and all that much against New England. If it were any other matchup, I think it'd be a slam dunk. Add Dare Ogunbowale. I wouldn't really want to trust either of these guys in the championship. I'd probably still lean Dare over Rex just because of the workload. But I'm certainly not high on either guy.
Yeah, I think that the other concern with Ogunbowale is they've added a bunch of guys. Raquel Armstead came back. They signed him out the Packers practice squad last week. He was not active. So if you make him active this week, I could see it devolving into a timeshare as well. And you put a timeshare in a situation where their implied total is 3 points. Probably not going to add up very well. So I think that big risks on both sides with those two guys.
The other thing to keep in mind is that Ogunbowale has never been utilized really as a bell cow. He's not, right. he's 200 pounds. He's a pass catcher, and that might not be a bad thing against New England because they're probably going to see a negative game script. But, regardless, it's just not something that I really want to bank hard on, especially, within that Jacksonville offense.
I'd agree for sure. Okay, let's talk to BJJ over here on YouTube once again. Let's start off with best defenses. I think defensive options probably not too bad for this week based on looking at 15 transactions. Do you have a preference on defenses you want to add for this week?
Yeah, I think Chicago's in a really interesting spot against the Giants. If you look at what the Giants have done this season, they rank 10th in adjusted fantasy points allowed, just as a unit offensively to opposing defenses. But then on top of that, if you look at what they've done, say what you want about Daniel Jones and his turnover proneness, et cetera, he's still better than what they've been trotting out over the last handful of weeks with Mike Lennon and Jake Fromm. Sorry, I know that you're a Fromm guy
No. That's old Jim. Old Jim doesn't matter anymore. Old Jim is no longer here.
Yes. And I'm clearly joking, just for the record. But yeah, so if you look at what they've done since Daniel Jones went down, the Giants offense has allowed opposing defenses to score 11.8 standard fantasy points per game against them. That's better than what Dallas has averaged this year. And Dallas is the defense one in all fantasy football this season. So basically you're getting a top defense with whoever faces the Giants. And Chicago's not great defensively. I'm not trying to sell it that way, but this is more of a matchup thing than anything else. There's other defenses out there like Cleveland, I think is at least a little bit intriguing against Pittsburgh. But I would still rather go with a team like Chicago just because we know that, the last time Pittsburgh and Cleveland played each other is sort of just like a really low scoring game, not a lot of turnovers. And I could see that happening again this week. And Pittsburgh's been at least relatively decent and not giving up a ton of sacks just because Ben Roethlisberger gets the ball out so quick. Yeah. Whereas with Chicago, there's just a huge ceiling no matter who they put under center.
Yeah, and the Chicago defense should be available, given that they just faced the Seahawks there as well. Other question from BJJ was, looking at some waiver wire wide receivers, can be pretty tough at times this time of year to find viable receivers off of waivers. Anybody standing out to you there in terms of guys who you could add and conceivably start for Week 17?
I mean, I still think that Isaiah McKenzie is viable. And the main reason for that is, there are COVID protocol changes that are currently kind of going on. And so that could really, really change things. Because Gabe Davis, when he tested, so Gabe Davis tested a day after Cole Beasley tested positive. And so both of them are unvaccinated, but the 10-day period put Gabriel Davis past their next game. So he was going to miss both games as long as everything stayed the same with the 10 days. And then Cole Beasley would have been able to come back on Saturday. And that means that, in that scenario, Beasley wouldn't be practicing all week and he wouldn't be with that team. And Isaiah McKenzie played the Beasley role. He played it arguably better than Beasley does. And they get a plus matchup this week. I mean, you're talking about a 28% target share and a Josh Allen led offense. I think that, to be fair, there was a lot of there's a better matchup for McKenzie in that game against New England than what you're going to get out of the perimeter guys. And they shouldn't have that same issue this week in the matchup against Atlanta. But regardless, I think McKenzie could still see if the COVID protocols stay the same. I think McKenzie could realistically see the slot role once again. And that is with, as long as Cole Beasley is sidelined. It's a little bit risky. Hopefully we get a little bit more word like closer to game time. But I think of all wide receivers out there, he's probably the one that I would target most.
Yeah, and there's upside there. If he does have a role, we know we can do well in it. I think that's a key thing to keep in mind here. I know we had another question about McKenzie later on as well. Let's talk to Smokey the cat in there twice. Should I drop Justin Jackson for Darren Waller? They already have Mike Gesicki. The cat has Mike Gesicki. Justin Jackson being moved back to a backup role with Austin Eckler being back. Would you drop him to add Waller to potentially upgrade from Gesicki here?
I don't love dropping handcuffs this time of year, but fortunately Austin Eckler just had COVID. So you don't have that risk with him this week. The biggest risk with Eckler is that he would get hurt during practice or something like that, which is obviously still possible. But I think this is the kind of move that you should be making. Gesicki, the Miami offense is just really, really terrible and just tough to trust. The passing attack outside of Jalen Waddle. I mean, we saw it this past week. Devontae Parker, I don't even think he saw a target in that game. Did he see a target in that game?
He saw one, but it was overturned by penalty. So it doesn't even count. May have lost JJ there. But yeah, I think that with Devontae Parker, not seeing a lot of work there. I do think that, Waller is definitely viable for sure. Okay, looks like JJ is back as well.
Yeah, sorry, I'm back. Yes, I agree. Waller, do it. Get Darren Waller, yes.
All right, perfect. But Justin Jackson hopefully served you well while he was there. Let's talk to the Air Crews here, talk about some quarterback streamers. Justin Fields, we don't have the health on yet. Taysom Hill facing Carolina. I'd assume he'll be back for this one, given the change to the protocol there. And then Matt Ryan, Atlanta, is going up against Buffalo. Pretty tough spot there. Who would you favor between these guys?
I'd go Taysom. I think that, what we've seen from him, he's averaging over 12 fantasy points per game this season and starts just with his legs. It's a continuation of what we saw last year as well. Carolina's not a scary defense. I'm not I'm not concerned about the matchup. So yeah, I would go Taysom Hill. I mean, you could make the argument for Justin Fields if he ends up going, but I think Taysom's just like a safer bet at this point in the week.
I think Taysom's above all those guys by a pretty
Yeah.
decent margin, assuming he does play for this week. Let's talk to Dark Tyrant. Sat Tyler Boyd for Marquez Callaway. Big regret. Sorry about that, Dark Tyrant. Not fun. Can Tyler Boyd get another game like he just had? Another question about the Bengals coming up later on, but interesting spot here versus Kansas City. Potential shootout. The Bengals home underdogs in this game. Is that a situation where you are trusting Tyler Boyd in general from a start-sit perspective?
I mean, look, you know that he's third fiddle in that offense. I'm not necessarily like I'm never going to be like super high on Tyler Boyd. And if you look at what happened this past week, they're facing arguably the against Baltimore. They faced arguably the most decimated secondary in all of football. And it's a secondary they had success against earlier in the season as well. Kansas City's defense is playing a lot better. I don't, if you're talking about Tyler Boyd versus Marquez Callaway, yeah, I'm starting Tyler Boyd over Callaway. Just because, the passing offense for, New Orleans isn't all that attractive. And, you're associating Tyler Boyd with a potential shootout, as you said. But you're going to want, T Higgins, Jamar Chase over a Tyler Boyd, and Kansas City isn't necessarily a matchup. I'm looking at my numbers right now. They're not necessarily a matchup that you, want to target from the slot and with slot guys. Yeah. So, he's fine. He's just a dude who probably is like in that wide receiver 3, maybe high end 4 range. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I view him right now.
Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense there. I mean, everyone in a shootout can be viable, but still keep in mind that Boyd is going to be the number 3 option there. Let's talk to DJ quickly. T Higgins and Joe Burrow, the best stack this week. So they were the best stack last week when they weren't super popular. Now they probably will be. What I would say, DJ, is I think if you're looking at the Bengals this week, Jamar Chase would be the guy I'd turn to for DFS, given that people are probably going to gravitate so heavily towards T Higgins. He just blew up. He has a lower salary. People looking at Chase and wondering when the production will come once again. So I think this is a good week to pivot to Chase for tournaments, but I'd also say I like both the Cardinals and the Cowboys from a stacking perspective a bit more. Also, Josh Allen paired with, potentially Dawson Knox, Devin Singletary, another route there. So I think we'll have better options in terms of stacking for this week. Let's talk to Scott on Facebook, looking for a quarterback streamer for championship week. Don't trust Lamar 1 week back from his ankle if he plays, and his backup broke his thumb against the Titans. So talking backups here, JJ, do you turn to Jimmy Garoppolo's backup in this situation if you're Scott?
That's exactly what I would do. I think Trey Lance is probably like a top 10 option this week, and people are going to probably get mad at me online for saying that. But the last time we saw Lance...
Are they mad you're not saying he's a top 3 option?
Yeah, exactly. The last time we saw Trey Lance was against Arizona. He ran the ball 16 times for 89 yards on the ground. He scored almost 15 fantasy points. And that was without a passing and rushing touchdown. And I sent a joke tweet out there yesterday saying that, I told people to draft Trey Lance this year because of this week 17 matchup against the Texans, which clearly, it was a bad idea to draft Trey Lance. But this week 17 matchup against the Texans, and I've gotten so many responses from people saying, oh, the Texans have been good against quarterbacks over the second half of the season. And, Justin Herbert, look what they did to guys. Justin Herbert last week didn't have Austin Eckler and Mike Williams, threw for over 330 yards. It's just the Chargers ran for a couple touchdowns or had the rushing scores, and they also just didn't play very well. You can't just look at the end result of the game and say it was because of the quarterback or that he wasn't good in fantasy. Justin Herbert was still QB 11 this past week, and if you look at who they've faced over this stretch where they've been good, it's been trash quarterbacks. I mean, just very, very subpar quarterbacks. Worried about this matchup. You should be playing Trey Lance.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is the first time we saw Trey Lance, George Kittle didn't play. And that's a very different situation than what we'll have this week. He is at home facing Houston with George Kittle versus on the road facing Arizona without George Kittle. That's a very different situation. So I think keep that in mind with Trey Lance. And along those same lines, David is asking if he's got Mac Jones, would you pick up Trey Lance in Superflex? Or I'm assuming he's got both here. I feel like, to me, it's a no-brainer you go Lance over Jones, and I feel like he's just kind of in a different tier. Do you agree with that sentiment as well?
Yeah, I would play Trey Lance 99.99% of the time over Mac Jones. I mean, it's not, I'm not saying that Mac Jones is a better or worse quarterback. It's just the way the fantasy football works. You know, if you're getting the rushing production, you're getting a really nice floor. You also get touchdown equity potential too with Trey Lance. So I'm very, very high on Lance this week.
I would agree with that as well. Okay, let's go get one more here about Trey Lance. Talking about Joseph here. Would you lower expectations for Deebo Samuel with Lance at quarterback? Now, looking back at that week 5 game, again, no George Kittle. I think Deebo had 9 targets in that game, but again, it was without George Kittle. In that game, their early down first half passer is 40% versus it's 50% with Jimmy Garoppolo starting. So basically, they took the approach of if they were in a neutral situation, they decreased their pass rate by 20% or about 10 percentage points. That's a shift, and it does lower Deebo. But I think that for me, JJ, especially with someone like Deebo and how effective he is, I'd have a hard time not using Deebo in season long if I had him, despite the fact that I would lower him with Lance starting. Where would you be with Deebo? And also we can talk about this with Ayuk and Kittle with Lance starting for this week, likely starting this week.
Yeah, I mean, like, sure, lower expectations. You know, I did a lot of studies over the offseason on what happens to pass catchers and running backs whenever a rookie quarterback takes over or is the starter for the majority of the season, and what happens when a mobile quarterback is the starter and plays for the majority of the season. And what I found was exactly what you talked about. They become more run heavy. And the other reason why, and all these numbers for these pass catchers goes down as a result of them being more run heavy and these quarterbacks just taking up more of the offense, right? Like think about Baltimore and Lamar Jackson. Yes, Mark Andrews balls out. Yes, Marquise Brown can have great games, but they have to be uber efficient in order for that to happen. And they can be because it's a good offense. But you can't just bank on that with a rookie quarterback in Trey Lance. So do I think that that we should lower expectations for those guys? Yeah, you should lower them at least somewhat, but I can't imagine you starting someone over Deebo or having a reasonable option to start over Deebo. I can't imagine you having a reasonable option to start over Kittle. Maybe Brandon Ayuk, like maybe you can make that argument. I think that there is an argument to make, but it just depends on who that player would be. I still think Ayuk is sort of in that like wide receiver 3 range, just given the matchup.
Yeah, Ayuk is the one who's worth most discussing here, and I think that will be relevant later on this week. Let's talk to Benjamin here about the Eagles' backfield. Assuming that both Jordan Howard and Boston Scott are healthy, which player would you lean between the two? And what's your general sentiment around them? We'll make this more applicable than to just Michael Carter here for the Jets, who are in a really rough spot versus Tampa Bay. So Howard has a stinger. It sounds like they are hoping/expecting he will play this week. What's your view of this Eagles' backfield with where it stands right now?
Look, I don't want to overthink it. Like, I think it's easy to overthink these situations. You know, if you look at what happened this past week, Boston Scott had more volume on the ground than Jordan Howard did, but the majority of that work came at the end of the game when that game was just completely out of hand. I mean, it was garbage time. If you look at what they've done over the last month, basically since Jordan Howard got to Philadelphia, I mean, it's been Jordan Howard playing either the 1A role or, the 1B role behind Miles Sanders. And so if we see that consistently week in and week out, we have to go by that information as opposed to saying, oh, Miles Sanders is out. Now all of a sudden they're going to change things up and Boston Scott's going to be, the primary back in this offense. I think both guys can be viable this week, though, just because they're playing a Washington team that they ran. The running backs had 200 rushing yards against Washington 2 weeks ago. It was one of the most dominant offensive line performances, I think, of the season by any team in that game. And if we see that again this week, which sure it's possible, then all of a sudden, both guys are going to be viable in their own way. I like you said, I think that Jordan Howard, it sounds like he's trending in the right direction, the way that they're talking about him, that they're hopeful that he's going to play. And if that's the case, I would play Howard over Boston Scott. I don't think adding Boston Scott's a bad idea in case that doesn't happen or in case you just need a flex play, because I think that Scott would still be a flex play. And then keep in mind that if Jordan Howard's out also, that has a trickle down as well. You have to look at Kenneth Gainwell all of a sudden too.
Right.
And if Kenneth Gainwell plays, that could actually, if Jordan Howard's out and Kenneth Gainwell plays, Boston Scott's in a good spot, of course, but Gainwell can look at and can steal some receiving work out of the backfield then too. So it can go a lot of different directions, but I would prioritize on the waiver wire right now today. I'd go Howard, then Scott, then Gainwell. And I would play, for the record, I would play both running backs probably over Michael Carter, just given the matchup that Michael Carter has.
Yeah, and looking back at the 3 games that Howard missed earlier, that Sanders missed earlier on this year, they played 3 games, and Howard was up for all of them. And in those 3 games, Howard and Scott had very similar yardage, 68.3 yards per game for Scott, total yards from scrimmage, that is, 68.3 for Scott, 70.3 from Howard. But Howard had 37% of the team's red zone chances, whereas Scott was at 13%. That's a big difference. And I would not expect that difference to go away given how good Jordan Howard has been in the red zone his entire career. So I think that's a key difference maker. And they were both worth adding for what JJ mentioned, but that's why, to me, I would also put Jordan Howard pretty decently above Boston Scott for this week. Similar vibe here from DJ. Rashad Penny or Boston Scott. This does depend a bit on probably DJ, looking. I feel like if you've got Rashad Penny and someone he's in your lineup, I think that Boston Scott would be worth add this week on the potential situation where we do see Jordan Howard sit, correct?
Yeah, I mean, but I would be playing Rashad Penny over Boston Scott, just straight.
Even if there's no Jordan Howard?
If there's no Jordan Howard, yeah, you can make the argument for sure. Yeah, I see what you're saying. If there's no Jordan Howard, you can definitely make the argument for Boston Scott. But just given the information we have right now, the answer would be Rashad Penny over Scott.
Yeah, I think that Howard's going to play, so it'd probably move. But I think that, I would agree with that as well. Let's talk to Joseph here. Looking for sentiment on some running backs potentially coming back from injury. It sounds like Eli Mitchell, I think, is a pretty good shot to play this week based on what they were saying last week about him. And then DeAndre Swift did practice last week, did not play. I bet they're both probably back this week, JJ. What's your confidence level in these guys coming off of injury?
I mean, I think that it's decent. I mean, I'm not like going to be worried about, overly worried about like Jeff Wilson with Eli Mitchell, just given how they've used Mitchell when he's been active this year. And I don't think that they're going to rush him back and play him when he's injured or anything like that either. And they seem to have been playing it pretty slow to begin with. And keep in mind, this is a very like San Francisco needs to basically win out, right? Like they just need to keep winning in order to have any sort of shot at the playoffs. So if that's the case, then they're going to put the best players on the field that they think are the best players. And I think that Eli Mitchell is that for San Francisco. Jeff Wilson's been fine, but Elijah Mitchell has a lot of explosion. He's really, really good in that offense. And then with DeAndre Swift, I mean, if he goes again, you have to assume that they're throwing their star running back when they're completely out of the playoff picture onto the field because he's 100% ready and healthy, right? And so if that's the case, then I think that you have to play DeAndre Swift as well. And just think you have to just basically say that you hope that the coaching staff is acting rationally.
Yeah, and every time they've had the chance to use Eli Mitchell this year, they have. And I think that's worth noting from a sentiment perspective. Let's talk to Grim Fan here, looking for a tight end. Dalton Schultz, Gerald Everett, or Evan Engram. I was looking at some Cowboys stuff today to get set for some DFS stuff this week, and I was kind of shocked to see that Dalton Schultz target share in the past 3 games with all 3 receivers healthy is still 17%, which is a lot higher than I thought it would be. Is that enough for you to put him above Everett and Engram for this week?
Yeah, because basically since Russell Wilson's been back, Gerald Everett's at like 17.5% per game target share. So you're looking at a similar target share between Schultz and Everett. Evan Engram, I don't want to touch, even though it's fine. Like if you but I don't want to touch Evan Engram. So it comes down to Schultz or Everett. I think Everett's fine as a streamer, but Dalton Schultz to me is still, I mean, he's been a top 10 guy all season long. And this is a matchup too, just in general, where we could see a decent amount of scoring. So I'm going to lean Schultz there.
Yeah, I think Schultz is almost in a tier of his own here. Pretty close to it, at least. Half tier above Everett, I would say. So Dr. Richard, more sentiment check here on Trey Lance. Would you consider starting him over Justin Herbert versus Denver or Joe Burrow versus Kansas City? Or is that where we reach the tipping point with Lance where you might stick with those other options?
I'll say this. I think that Lance is probably in the same tier as those guys.
I agree.
But if you don't want to kind of play aggressively, which I truly think that Lance is a safer play than people think just because of his rushing, right? Like it's going to be there if Lance goes. And so if you want to play it safe, if you will, from the all that kind of stuff.
All right, looks like we may have lost JJ again here. So we'll go on to Shake and Bake 145. Talking about the Saints defense and the Bears defense. JJ back just in time. Talk about the Bears defense once again. You gave your thoughts on the Bears, said you were cool with them. would you use him above the Saints facing whatever it is the Panthers are deciding to do on offense?
I think that I would play the Saints just because the Saints unit is better. But I can make an argument for the Bears like I did earlier for sure. But I think I'd still go with the Saints just because it's a better defensive unit in general.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. Okay, Goat is asking for some DFS stuff for this week. Small field GPP plays this week. I think the Bills actually grade out really well there because in a small field, you do not need as much upside, and I can worry less about the large spread in that game. And the Bills, when they've torched people this year, Josh Allen has scored 30-plus points, I believe, in 3 out of 9 games. He's had 35-plus in 2 out of those 9 games. So I like Allen a lot from that perspective. I know he's the highest salary guy, but, whatever. I think that grades out well there. And then also Cardinals, Cowboys, a lot of guys in that game under salaried. So I'd check them out too. Talk some more defense here with Joseph, looking for defense between the Bills, Eagles, Saints, and Bears. We've not talked Bills yet or Eagles. Both those teams are good matchups. Bills, though, are 13.5-point favorites.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on these 4?
It'd be tough to not play the Bills this week. I think they're in just a great spot. Atlanta's been one of the worst teams in adjusted fantasy points allowed for defenses.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, one more defensive question here from Larry. Should I pick up and play Indianapolis or the New England defense? New England is facing the Jaguars.
Yeah, you're
Indy's
playing
facing
New
the
England.
Raiders.
You're playing New England.
Is there anyone you you use above New England this week? Probably not.
I can't think. I think coming off a loss too, you got to think that they're going to destroy Jacksonville.
I would agree with that as well. Okay, let's do one more Lance question here, just because I think this is kind of a fun exercise. Matthew Stafford facing the Ravens. Ravens secondary, super beat up, but also it's Trey Lance against Houston.
I'm still going Stafford. I can definitely make the argument. Again, I'm way higher on Lance probably than the majority of people watching this right now. But I think Stafford it's one of those plays where you're in the championship. If you were to play Trey Lance over Stafford, and if Stafford even scores 3 more points than Lance and you lose because of that, you're going to beat yourself up over it over the entire offseason. Whereas if the reverse happens, I think that Stafford's still a logical play. I mean, Baltimore's secondary is so beat up and so bad right now. I mean, this is the dream matchup for this Rams offense. And it's exactly what they need after, this past week. They really didn't look that good through the air. So I think Stafford's in an incredible spot this week.
Yeah, I think that the overall takeaway from the Trey Lance discussion is that A, you should add him if you need a quarterback. B, he's in that tier of like those mid-range quarterback ones. So like he's not Mahomes. He's not, I wouldn't say Kyler. He's not Josh Allen. But those like second tier quarterback ones, the guys you've probably been using throughout the year and have felt pretty good about, he's in that discussion. He may not be above them, but he's in that discussion. I think that's the overall takeaway from the Lance discussion for today. Okay. That is all the time that we have here for today on the final waiver wire Q&A of the 2021 season. I want to thank all of you for tuning in throughout this year, asking very good, very intelligent questions, being respectful in the comments. We appreciate that so much for all of you throughout the year. JJ, thank you for your time as well, for spreading your knowledge. Where can people find 15 transactions and more from you?
Yeah, the column's over on numberfire.com, and then the podcast, the Late Round Podcast, you can search anywhere podcasts can be found. And again, thank you guys all year. This has been a great show to do with Jim. And like he said, you can do a lot of these shows sometimes, and people aren't the kindest and not always the most respectful. And you guys, everyone who's joined week in and week out, it's been a lot of fun to talk fantasy and hopefully win some fantasy championships now.
Let's go win the championship, everybody. Appreciate all of you. Congratulations on making it here. Thank you, JJ, for helping us out. Thank you to Joy Affleck, our video producer, for running the video side of things here today. Thank you, Joy, as always. DJ will win the Survivor League next year. Love to see it. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't ask me, Jay or DJ. That's how you win next year. We'll talk to you all in 2022. This has been the Waiver Wire Q&A.